In 1994, a family in rural Nebraska moved into a farmhouse that had been abandoned for 30 years. The previous owners, the Millers, had vanished mid-dinner, leaving plates of rotting food on the table. The only thing they left behind was a warning carved into the cellar door: "Do not count the rows in the corn after sunset." The new owner, Elias, laughed at the superstition. He was a practical man who saw only profit in the golden fields. On his first night, he sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind began to whistle through the stalks, creating a sound like thousands of dry, hushed voices whispering his name in unison. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the field, counting the rows as he walked. 1, 2, 3. By the time he reached the 40th row, the farmhouse was invisible behind the towering stalks. The air grew unnaturally cold, and the smell of ozone filled his lungs. Then he noticed the rows were moving on their own. The corn wasn't swaying with the wind. It was leaning away from something in the center of the field. Elias reached row 50 and stopped dead. Standing there was a figure made entirely of husks and silk, wearing the tattered overalls of the missing Mr. Miller. It had no face, only a hollow cavity where a mouth should be. The figure didn't move, but Elias felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest. He looked down and saw thin, green tendrils emerging from his own skin. He tried to scream, but his throat felt full of dry silk. He realized the corn wasn't growing from the soil. It was growing from the people who dared to count the rows. Elias's wife found his boots the next morning standing perfectly upright at the edge of the field. There was no sign of a struggle, only a new row of corn that hadn't been there the day before. The stalks in that row were taller than the rest, and they seemed to bleed a thick amber sap when she touched them. She fled the farm, but as she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. In the middle of the field, a new figure stood, wearing Elias's favorite flannel shirt. It raised a hand made of twisted husks, waving a slow, jerky goodbye. The field was hungry, and it was already waiting for the next family to move in. The next owners arrived in 1999, unaware of the farm's history. They were a young couple, Sarah and Mark, looking for a quiet life. On their first night, they found a Polaroid camera in the attic. It contained one undeveloped photo. When they shook it dry, it revealed a blurry image of their own car pulled up in the driveway, taken from inside the corn. Mark, a former soldier, didn't believe in ghosts. He grabbed a machete and began hacking at the stalks near the porch, determined to clear a perimeter. But as the blade bit into the grain, he heard a high-pitched, human-like shriek. Instead of clear sap, a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of iron began to spray from the severed husks. That evening, the temperature plummeted. Sarah looked out the kitchen window and saw Mark standing perfectly still in the middle of the yard. He wasn't moving, his back turned to her. When she called his name, he didn't respond. He just slowly pointed a stiff, trembling finger toward the 41st row of the cornfield. "The rows," Mark whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Sarah, there are too many. I counted 40 yesterday. Now there are 42. As he spoke, Sarah noticed something horrifying. Mark's fingernails had turned into hard, yellow kernels, and thin green shoots were curling out from under his collar. Sarah tried to pull him toward the car, but Mark was rooted to the spot. Literally. When she looked down, she saw thick, pale roots bursting through his leather boots, anchoring him into the Nebraska soil. He looked at her one last time, his eyes turning a milky, vegetative white. "Don't let them count you," he wheezed. The corn began to move toward the house. It wasn't growing. It was walking. Thousands of stalks uprooted themselves, their roots acting like spindly legs. They surrounded the porch in a rustling tide. Sarah locked herself in the cellar, the same one where the Miller family had left their warning. She could hear them scratching at the wood. In the dark of the cellar, Sarah found a journal hidden behind a loose brick. It belonged to the Miller daughter. The last entry read, "The grain doesn't want our land. It wants our skin. It weaves us into the field so it can stand upright. If you hear the husking sound, it's already too late. You're part of the harvest now." In the dark of the cellar, Sarah found a journal hidden behind a loose brick. It belonged to the Miller daughter. The last entry read, "The grain doesn't want our land. It wants our skin. It weaves us into the field so it can stand upright. If you hear the husking sound, it's already too late. You're part of the harvest now." Suddenly, the scratching stopped. A heavy silence fell over the farm. Sarah peeked through a crack in the cellar door. The sun was rising and the field looked peaceful again. Standing right outside the door were two figures. One wore a flannel shirt, and the other wore the tattered overalls of a man from 1924. They were waiting for her to come out.